Hello, I'm Jean Boase-Beier, and I'm going to be talking to Laima Vincė, who we can also see. Now, let me just tell you who I am. I'm Professor Emerita. I can't even remember who I am. I'm Professor Emerita of Literature and Translation at the University of East Anglia. And I'm also an academic writer and translator. And actually, we're not going to be talking about me, so I won't say any more, just to say that I am translations editor for ARC Publications. And I'm very pleased to be talking to Laima Vincė, who has recently done a chapbook for ARC Publications. This is the book that I hope people can see here. And this is a chapbook of translations by Matilda Olkinaitė, and it's called The Cerulean Bird, and it's translations of poems done by Laima from Lithuanian. Now, Laima is herself a writer and translator, mainly from Lithuanian. She's also a painter, and she's also an academic, and she is adjunct professor of English at the University of Southern Maine. So we're going to start by Laima reading us just a couple of poems from this book. So would you like to start there, Laima?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation, and it's always a pleasure to be able to share Matilda's work, because one of the things that she wrote about in her diary was that she really wanted her voice to be heard, but she knew she could not be heard at the time when she was living, first because of the Soviet-Russian occupation of Lithuania and then the Nazi-German occupation of Lithuania. So I'd like to share a poem. It's titled A Word, and this poem was published in one of Lithuania's major dailies, May 11, 1940. So World War II had already started. Lithuania was occupied by Soviet Russia. As a matter of fact, Matilda was anti-communist, and she was a patriot of Lithuania and a believer in democracy and rule of law. But she was also a university student, and she was just 18 when she wrote this poem. And this poem came from her sense of frustration of wanting to be able to have a voice and knowing she had none, living under a totalitarian occupation. So I'm going to read the poem in English first, and then I'm going to transition into Lithuanian, which is the language that she chose to write her poetry in. Although she grew up speaking Yiddish and Russian at home, learned Lithuanian in school, then she added on French, German, and Polish to her languages. A word. It is so difficult for me. I'd like to utter just one word. That unspoken word trembles within me. I see processions, generations, gliding past, and a blue longing and shivering suffering, and joy quivering in tiny rays of light, and the pain of an eon of shattered hopes. But I am that unspoken word and shadow. I carry that unspoken word in my heart. It is so difficult for me. I'd like to utter that one word, just one word for the crowds and for the nations. The processions would pause, time would come to a halt, all the generations would stop and listen, and my word would flutter above the mountains and the seas, above flowing rivers and rough waters, and longing and trembling suffering would cease, and the pain of an eon of shattered hopes. Žodis. Man taip sunku, aš taip norėčiau tarti žodį. Nepasakytas žodis virpa manyje. Matau, pro šalį plaukia eisenos ir kartos, ir melsvas ilgesys, ir virpanti kančia, ir džiaugsmas plazdantis mažyčiais spindulėliais, ir amžių skausmas dėl sudužusių vilčių, o aš nepasakytas žodis ir šešėlis. Širdį nepasakytą žodį aš nešiu. Man taip sunku, aš taip norėčiau žodį tarti. Tik vieną žodį minioms ir tautoms. Sustotų eisenos, sustotų ilgos kartos, sustotų kartos paklausyti jo. Ir virš kalnų, virš marių jis plasnotų, virš upių tekančių ir neramių versmių. Ir ilgesys, ir virpanti kančia sustotų. Ir amžių skausmas dėl sudužusių vilčių. So 6 months after that poem was written, Matilda was murdered in the Holocaust along with her 2 younger sisters and her parents. And I had the great privilege to find and meet Matilda's childhood closest friend, Lucia Neniškytė Vizgirdienė, who was in her 90s, and she recited to me a poem from memory that Matilda wrote for her and published in a magazine in 1940. And Lucia told me that that Matilda shared this poem with her the last time that they met, the last time she saw her alive, and she committed it to her memory and was able to pass on this poem so that it appears in this book. And this is a poem that is set in the town that Matilda grew up in, Panemunėlis, and her friend Lucia, who lived with her grandparents there. They were millers in the town, and their small business in their home was confiscated by Soviet Russians, and they had to leave very suddenly, and the family had no idea of their fate for a long time. Your tiny room was white, filled with sunlight, and your shutters were white too. You dried mint on your windowsill. Every spring you picked violets and kept them in water on your table. Every night you wound your ancient clock. Tell me why that night the wind blew out your candle. Who rapped on your window, paused a moment, then left? It was your fate calling, knocking quietly on your white shutters. It stopped your old clock. It snuffed out your white candle. Your tiny room was white, filled with sunlight. But the world is so wide. Where will you go, beloved?
Thank you very much for reading those 2 poems to us, and of course it's very good to hear the Lithuanian as well. And I know, as you said, it's very important that we keep the voices of people like Matilda Olkinaitė, who, well, they were murdered, and we wouldn't know anything about them. We would never hear them otherwise. I suppose the poet won't be very familiar to most people who are listening to us, and so maybe you could, well, I suppose she would be possibly if they're Lithuanian, but maybe not for English speakers. So maybe you could say a little bit more about her. I mean, we've gathered a little bit about her. Could you say a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Matilda's voice as a poet was silenced for 70 years. She was born in the small agricultural town of Panemunėlis in northern Lithuania, near the border with Latvia, in June 6, 1922. She had a peaceful, happy childhood, growing up in that town where Jewish and Lithuanian families lived integrated lives, and she didn't experience anti-Semitism growing up. And in fact, the local parish priest was her father's close friend. And so she went off to study at Vilnius University in 1940, and she was studying Russian literature and French literature. And the Lithuanian literature professors, who were all very well-known, famous classic writers now, took an interest in her and invited her to read poems at literary festivals. She had been publishing her poetry since the age of 9, interestingly enough, first in children's magazines and then in national magazines. So she was considered a child prodigy in her times. Of course, all that came to an end with the Nazi invasion of Lithuania when she and her family were arrested, and they were shot and murdered in the forest outside of her small town. The parish priest, Matelionis, who was a close family friend, at first managed to talk the Nazis into letting them come with him, allegedly to be forced laborers, and he hid them in the rectory. But one night, Matilda's father went out for a walk, and he saw a proclamation, a Nazi proclamation that read that any person who was hiding Jews would be executed on the spot. And he weighed the moral consequences, and he went back and he told his family that they could not risk the priest's life to save their own. And so they left that very night and turned themselves in to the local Nazis and the Lithuanian collaborators who were assisting the local Nazis. Before she left, she handed over her notebook, her handwritten notebook of poems, and her diary to Father Matelionis, who hid them underneath the great altar of the church in the town. And many years later, those notebooks were retrieved by the church organist. Father Matelionis, when the Soviets came back in 1944, was arrested and deported to Siberia. So I translated the poems and the diary from the handwritten notebooks. Okay, and those handwritten notebooks only survived because that organist brought them to Holocaust survivor Dr. Irena Veisaitė, who hid them in her home until Lithuania became free in 1991, became a free and independent country. And even though this seems so innocent, poems written by a university student, as Irena herself explained to me, they would have been considered anti-Soviet and dangerous, and anyone in possession of them could have been arrested and sent to Siberia or imprisoned, because the poems are very beautiful. They reflect the spirit of freedom, independence, joy, an independent life, living a life, making one's own life choices, and they did not reflect any propagandistic Soviet Russian propaganda as was required of poets at that time. And as a matter of fact, in her diary, she criticizes several of her beloved Lithuanian poets who, during the Soviet Russian occupation, kind of joined with the occupiers and wrote odes to Stalin and other really horrible poetry and supported that regime. And she criticizes them, and she wrote that she never would sacrifice her artistic talent to serve a regime. So she was very strong in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, that gives us a real insight, I think, into her situation, and also a little bit of her personality, because of course when people are killed so young or die so young, in her case, of course, she was murdered. You never know how they would have developed later, do you? Also as a poet. So we know how her work got out, and what was it that made you specifically want to translate her work then? How did you come to actually start translating her work?
Okay, well, I had a very, very strong feeling about why I translated her work when I was first able to read her diaries, and I really was able to connect with her as a person and get a sense of who she was. And I mean, she wrote beautifully and with so much insight, and it's hard to believe that she was so young. But I also remembered myself at that age, 16, 17, 18 years old. That was when I started writing poetry, and I'm also a published poet now. And I just thought to myself that if I were at that age where you're just starting to discover the world, and you're writing your first poems, and you're so excited about words and imagery and metaphor and just expressing yourself through poetry, And Matilda had put together her first collection of poems, but she wrote in her diary that she could not publish it because she refused to write any kind of Soviet Russian ideology. She just didn't like ideology or force and authoritarianism, and she refused to serve the regime. And she recognized, and she felt very depressed about that her poems would never be published. But then I imagined how she must have felt when they went back into incarceration. And she was an avid reader of the news. She has a poem, her poem, My People, was written in response to Kristallnacht in Germany. So she really had a sense that she would not survive. And so I just imagined myself, if I were in that situation, young, she was in love, writing, just opening up and blossoming as a writer, as a poet, and then you had to go and face your own execution. I would feel that I would want somebody to come along later in history and to find those poems and to have them published in the original language, but then also to bring them out into the world. And what better way to reach an international audience than by translating the poems into English. So I felt for me, this was a spiritual journey. It really wasn't about career or publications or anything like that. It was really about giving this young woman who had been so wronged a voice and allowing her voice to be heard. And what's so interesting to me is that when I first started working on these poems in 2017, it felt like a history project, like I was a memory project. But now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia threatening to invade Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, with the war that's taking place between Israel and Hamas, and what's happening to the people in Gaza, and what happened to the people who were murdered in Israel on October 7th, and Myanmar, and how young people in their 20s are going out into the jungles and fighting for democracy. And so within that context, the context we're living in now, I think that Matilda has a very strong voice again, and her poetry and her diary have so much to say for people now who are in their teens and their 20s and who are just coming of age into such a chaotic world. I think that through all those, it's 100 years that, we've celebrated her centennial in 2022. So over the expanse of all those years, Matilda is still speaking to us. And I do think in particular to people who are in the age that she was when she was killed. And I believe that she would have been a great poet had she survived. Because another thing that's very important to remember about Matilda is that she synthesized her Jewish heritage with her Lithuanian culture and Lithuanian upbringing. And she really saw that these were not separate entities. So in a single poem, you're going to have biblical references from the Old Testament and then Lithuanian pagan symbolism, like the sun. She writes a lot about the sun. Well, the sun goddess is one of the chief female deities in Lithuanian pagan pantheism. So she always has the sun goddess riding in on her chariot, but at the same time, she's writing about being Jewish. So she really had this dual identity that she was bringing into her literary work, which I think was really reflecting the world that she was growing up in and living in, and which was destroyed because 95% of Lithuania's Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, and that world is gone. And there's only small fragments, shards, like the work of Samuel Bach, for example, Matilda Olkinaitė, these few artists and writers who survived.
Yeah. No, it's true. Of course, what's one of the things that is fascinating about this, about her work and that of other people in, unfortunately in very similar situations who were murdered in the Holocaust, simply for being Jewish or whatever the reason was. It wasn't always, of course, because they were Jewish. But yeah, this kind of what you said about her dual the two cultures, at least two cultures that she combined, as well as, of course, the many languages she spoke. I mean, did you just, kind of coming to the end of our time, but it's so interesting to think about how this also affects the translation. Do you think there is a way in which, is there a particular way you translated, or was the kind of multilingual heritage and multicultural heritage, did it affect the way you translated?
Oh, most definitely. For example, she uses certain specific Yiddish words like mensch. And now I grew up in New York City, so, we always had, Yiddish words mixed into our cultural context. And I went to high school in Germany, so I speak German. So there were certain words like mensch, which I translated in Lithuanian as žmogus, which means being a human being who has ethics, morality, depth. It means so much. So sensitivity to how she brings in specific Yiddish words that she mixes into her Lithuanian. The other thing is, I realized while looking at these diaries in Lithuania together with other researchers, Lithuanian researchers, there were things in the poems, concepts in the poems and in the diaries that they could not understand because inside Lithuania, the language had changed so much. Matilda wrote the way my grandparents spoke. So I was able to understand immediately a lot of the subtleties of her language. But there's a most important thing about translating Matilda's poetry is that her style is deceptively simple on the surface, especially her younger poems written when she was 14, 15, 16. You might think, if you were a superficial reader, you think, oh, this is some schoolgirl writing about butterflies and sunshine and and white lilies, and what does that mean to me? But underneath that layer, there are so many layers of depth, and symbolism is very strong. And she created her own code of symbols. So when she talked about the brown-eyed people or the dark-eyed people, she meant the Jewish people. When she talked about the blue-eyed, she was talking about the Lithuanians. And so she, when you really go, I really had to go very deep into her poetry, and I created my own map of symbols and what they meant specifically, consistently throughout the poem. So she was creating this whole beautiful world. And I also want to say a word about Google Translate and ChatGPT, because what I've been hearing from a lot of publishing houses inside Lithuania and in the US as well, is that the new approach to literary translation is to put the translation into Google Translate and then take the word salad that comes out of it and put it into ChatGPT to clean it up, and you're going to get some mediocre middle-of-the-road translation. That would never work with Matilda because you would lose all those layers of subtlety that you have to find by really working, with her work and studying her diary and doing what I did, finding the surviving childhood friends who were still alive at that time and spending many hours sitting and talking with them and interviewing them and learning more about that world. There's so much context. So also there's like this spiritual connection you have to have. You as a translator, I felt very connected to Matilda. I felt as if her voice was speaking through me. And I felt this very deep importance around this project. And this importance, this urgency that she be heard. So I don't think that machine translations, no matter how good the technology gets, could ever replicate that process and the subtlety of a true literary translation. I mean, I think they would just be these soulless, mediocre, word for word approximations of a poem or a novel.
Yeah, I mean, and it's very, of course, this is a discussion that's ongoing at the moment, and it's so interesting because, of course, if that the very connection that you've just been talking about now, if that connection is never built up, then who is going to publicize the work, even if it were, translated by some form of AI? What would happen then? Because if that kind of spiritual connection you've been talking about, if that wasn't there, there would be nobody to be a champion for that work anyway. So it would be pointless, wouldn't it, even to do it, even if it were possible. So, I mean, that's, you know, I'm just thinking this as you've been talking, how important that connection is. You know, it's not just for the translation, is it? It's for everything that comes afterwards. But unfortunately, yeah, go on quickly.
No, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine. Go on.
Corporations would say, but that's the job of a publicist.
Well, doesn't work like that, does it ever? But yeah,
no.
But that's brilliant. It's really lovely to talk to you. And just to remind people watching and listening, this is the book that we've been talking about. It's the chapbook, The Cerulean Bird. It's the poems of Matilda Olkinaitė, and it's translated by Laima Vincė. And we have just been talking about that for a little bit. And well, that's it. So thank you, everybody, for listening to us, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.